So in the gospel for today, Jesus came across a man born blind. And notice that the first question the disciples had for him was not, Lord, how can we help this guy with such a difficult lot? Nor was it, hey, Lord, you think you could heal him? They did exactly what people so often do. They sought to assign blame. When a person is in a difficult spot, it is human nature to try to figure out if he did it to himself. I guess in a way to human beings, it just somehow seems better, more just, if people get what they deserve. As long as I don't get what I deserve. We don't want that. See, if I can assign blame to a person who's in a difficult situation, then I can feel safe because I'm sure that I've made all the right choices and that he made all the wrong ones. It occurs to me that if human beings devoted 1/10 of the amount of energy they spend on trying to find out who's to blame, we could solve all kinds of problems. We could move mountains. So the disciples wanted to know, was it his fault that he had been born blind? Or was it his parents' fault? Whose sin was it? Well, they were correct in understanding that all sickness and all disability comes from sin. They just missed the point that it's not a one-to-one correlation. Whose sin caused the man to be born blind, him or his parents? The question assumes that one-to-one correlation, a particular sin and a particular consequence for that sin. Now, having said that, we know that children do indeed suffer from their parents' sins. We see that as a reality in the church today. And speaking very generally about the church across denominational boundaries, we see a decline in church attendance today. And one thing that certainly affects that is this scenario. People who were born in the, say, 30s and 40s and raising their children later on did not consider church and Jesus to be the absolute center of their lives. And they treated church very often sort of like a social club, not the absolute center. Mom and Dad were faithful believers. They had been sitting in church alongside Grandma and Grandpa every Sunday. But they didn't think of it as the absolute center of everything. And so when their kids were growing up, well, Sunday school was kind of boring. And so they didn't make the kids go all the time. And, you know, church was okay, but it didn't have to be an every Sunday kind of thing. And you know what happens when we let ourselves get out of the habit of anything. And pretty soon, the kids were sporadic in Sunday school and went to Christmas Eve and Easter and Mother's Day and a few other random Sundays that Grandma insisted that they be there for. The problem is, the kids still believed in Jesus, but they didn't form the bonds at the church that their parents had formed. They didn't know who their Sunday school teacher was, much less recognize her at the Jewel and run up and hug her. And the pastor was just some guy up in the front of the church saying stuff. He didn't know their names. He didn't know who they were. And so the kids felt like the church was an even less important factor than their parents had. And the church slowly moved from the absolute center of family life to something as peripheral as a favorite restaurant. That's how the sins of the parents affect the children. If the parents had devoutly kept the third commandment to keep the Sabbath day holy, it would be more likely that the church would still be the center of their children's lives. There's no guarantees, as everyone who's raised kids knows, but it would be more likely. However, thankfully, no one suffers a sin in a one-to-one correlation or a consequence for a sin in a one-to-one correlation. We just simply suffer because sin exists. And sin exists until Jesus returns. So sitting around and trying to decide who to blame is a huge waste of time. It's all our faults. We're all to blame. Confirmation students are always trying to blame Adam and Eve. They're always saying, if Adam and Eve hadn't sinned, we wouldn't be in this predicament. And I always say, okay, I'll buy into that. But in order for me to buy into that, you have to stop sinning. As soon as you stop sinning, then you can be self-righteous and you can blame whoever you like. See, Jesus pointed out to the disciples that fault was meaningless. Sin is your fault. Sin is my fault. There's no way to assign a correlation to any sin. I can assign blame all I want, going back generation to generation until we get back to Adam and Eve. But in the end, sin is yours. Own it. I personally kind of grow weary of people trying to blame their parents for every sin they ever commit. I mean, if you were raised by Jack the Ripper and Lizzie Borden, at some point you have to take responsibility for your own choices, right? Your own sins. You have to own them. Having said that, look what Jesus says about this question as to why the man was born blind. He says, it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Have you ever considered that when we think of something as bad, when bad stuff happens, it has nothing to do with the fault of anyone? Not only that, but perhaps, just perhaps, it's not all that bad. COVID-19, is it China's fault? Is it President Trump's fault? Is it even a bad thing? Well, it may seem bad. It certainly seems bad to us when we're dealing with the consequences of it. But it's God's promise to work all things for our good. And either you believe that you're in the palm of God's hand, or you don't. And if you do, then nothing really bad can happen to you. Anything that happens is going to be turned for your good and for the good of those who love God. We face difficulties and challenges in this life. And yes, they all come from sin, because all difficulties and all challenges come from sin, but they're never for our punishment. Jesus was punished in hell for all sin. The payment's been made. Now, every challenge, every disability, every problem, even COVID-19, is to show the glory of God in our lives. So let me tell you about my friend Louise. Louise sat in her hospital bed, slowly dying of cancer. She was a devoutly Christian woman who had been ready to die for months. But she kept on living. Hardly eating, unable to get out of bed anymore, too weak to even hold her Bible up to read it. And she said so many times that she did not know why God was even keeping her here. At her funeral, dozens of people from the hospital and from the nursing home came. Buddhists, Hindus, atheists, agnostics, Christians, even a couple of people from Islam. They all came to see the God about whom Louise had told them, and to marvel at the faith given to this mightily valiant woman. Louise never knew, at least this side of heaven, she never knew that the most important work of her life, her magnum opus, was done when she was at her very weakest. That was when God used her to show forth his magnificent glory. That cancer was not because Louise had sinned or because her parents had sinned. It was so that the works of God might be displayed in her. It's just not about us. How is God displaying his works in you? How is he using you to show forth his love and his mercy. That's all that really matters.